Hi, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this inaugural talk. I was very flattered to be invited by Rodrigo Firmino to do this talk, and I want to thank you for that invitation. So, obrigada, and thank you all for participating in this talk, and look forward to having some feedback once you've watched it. I'm very sorry I cannot do this live, but in South Africa, we celebrate Easter in its totality, any excuse for a holiday. So on the Monday that you start your semester, I'll be safely ensconced in the Drakensberg Mountains in KwaZulu-Natal province of South Africa. So thank you all. And what I want to talk to you about really is work in progress. It's work that a research interest that I share with Rodrigo and many others. And it's something that I feel quite passionate about and that I believe is really of relevance to anyone that is interested in studying cities, especially in the global south. It's work in progress in a sense that I've explored this work elsewhere, but this is essentially part of my ongoing mission to get under the skin of what is commonly referred to as the smart city, or what I'd like to think of as the real smart city, what is really going on. So before the world exploded and before the pandemic hit us, and I think Brazil and South Africa are both in positions of incredible vulnerability with regard to the pandemic. So I do send my very good wishes, best wishes to you and your loved ones. And I hope you're staying safe and largely sane. But before all of this happened in early 2020, I spent a month of my sabbatical in Kampala in Uganda and Nairobi in Kenya to explore a specific dimension of smartness, and that is digital disruption and what that might look like in relation to cities in Africa, or in this case, in East Africa. And really my point of departure is just that I have an issue, or I have a problem with how the smart city is promoted in the African context. It's a growing literature. I'm certainly not the only one with this problem. If we look at the literature in recent critical geography, it explores the kind of neoliberal underbelly of many smart city initiatives. But it's a growing literature that crosses scales and disciplines. So whilst there's a worry about how the smart city narrative is essentially used to promote what is essentially edge cities or satellite cities by developers, especially in African cities where there's a lot of property speculation. There are other codes and discourses that we need to be aware of that pretty much talk to the same outcome: eco-cities, green urbanism, smart growth. I mean, these are all sort of discourses that are used interchangeably to essentially refer to exclusionary urban development. So this is one of the issues I have, is that it's mostly a discourse and sometimes a threat to incumbent livelihoods in cities where we have terrible inequalities, like we have in Latin America and in the sub-Saharan Africa. But I think there's also the issue that the way that the smart city is promoted, especially in the corporate literature, is often to do with the fact that the power of technology is seen to be the transformative agent of change. So there's this technological determinism that I believe is highly problematic, because I would like to argue that that's just part of the story. There's also not much clarity on what exactly the smart city is supposed to solve. Certainly in the African context, if you look at the websites of PricewaterhouseCoopers and Siemens and your sort of big multinational technology companies, or indeed your big management consultancies, there's talk about this terrible threat that awaits African cities, and that they're urbanizing so rapidly and they might be left behind. And I guess my question is always, left behind in terms of what? What are we being left behind from? There's also very little relation to the existing city. I mean, if you look at the visual in front of you, I mean, what you see as a kind of visual narrative that is completely devoid of any reality with regard to your typical African city. I mean, even your South African cities, which are generally, in some cases, more developed, not always. This is the kind of visual narrative that, again, has very little sort of resonance in what we're familiar with on a day-to-day basis. And like I said before, smart is often a code for gated estates and edge cities. So my own work and others, I mean, one emerging voice in this terrain that I can recommend you read is Prince Guma, who writes out of Nairobi, out of East Africa. But there's some interesting literature that's coming out of the African context, and I suspect probably possibly the Latin American context as well. If I had any Portuguese or if my Spanish was any better, I'd be able to share that with you properly. But there's a kind of growing exploration of what smart urbanism, as opposed to the smart city, but smart urbanism as the way that people live their daily lives looks like in Africa. And certainly in my research, what I've found is that there's a mix of the old and the new. There's a mix of old technologies, new technologies. People mix them up in accordance with their livelihood strategies. So smart technologies are deeply entangled with livelihoods and lifestyles, and often incorporated into urban practices. So what we end up with is a kind of hybrid arrangement of technologies and how they interface with urban livelihoods. So what is shaping cities, though, are not the technologies as such, despite the claims and corporate visions to the contrary, but the interface between technology and users. It's that socio-technical interface that I think is what is far more interesting to think about. Recently, with my friend Alessandro Origi, who's at Plymouth University, we've been exploring this notion of smart urbanism in place. And this would be, of course, of great relevance to those of you who are doing degrees in architecture and urban design. And I know in the Brazilian context, that goes hand in hand with any urbanism degree that you might be doing, as opposed to the South African context, where we often separate out those fields of study. But what we found in a book that we published recently, it's an edited volume, and we have quite a range of chapters from many places across the world. I think there's only one Latin American chapter, I'm ashamed to say, and that's from Colombia. But what we found is that in asking our contributors to this volume, how do you enhance place through use of technologies? We found that top-down design-led interventions that use smart technologies to augment space, I'll seldom connect with the qualities of place. We find that whether it's media architecture or whether it's interventions in the form of kind of digitally enhanced street furniture, that there's often a kind of lack of contextualization. And that what we're finding, the more sort of successful initiatives in our book, we found, are the ones where there are collaborative approaches to enable representation of locals in whatever gets done in public spaces, and that there's more co-productive processes emerging. So I guess what I'm saying to you is that even in urban practices, there's some emergent practices that kind of see technology as just part of the dialogue rather than the thing that makes place in our cities. So in examining this interface between technology and users, what drives content is not the technology, but the issues of the day. And that's no big surprise. So it's the result of these interactions that we can kind of become more interested in this notion of recombined places. This is a term that was coined by William Mitchell in 1996, when most of you are probably not even born. And it spoke of recombination in architecture as a result of the digital age, where parts of buildings can be repurposed through smart means and recombined differently. So the notion of recombination is actually quite a nice thing to revisit when we look at kind of different contexts. I mean, William Mitchell was based at MIT and his work was coming out of Boston. So it's interesting to think about how these bits and pieces can be recombined in different contexts where people are kind of drawn together in public space. So what draws people together in public space, looking at the first bullet point on the slide, is it's basically as part of how community protest, storytelling, or mediated performances are malleable themes threaded through many forms of media. So it's a mouthful, and I'm saying it in English, not in your native Portuguese. But I mean, essentially what I'm trying to say with that point, and what others are also saying, is that digital technologies are taken, are appropriated and recombined in processes of ongoing transformation in the public realm, in the public world. And those processes of transformation can find their voices through protest action, as is evident in South Africa in particular, where we have a very kind of active civic kind of community around. I mean, we often have protests around service delivery, which is a big issue, and that is increasingly finding its voice through digital means, but also storytelling, mediated performances. I think it's very interesting to see how these evolve in public spaces in conjunction with the use of digital technologies. And digital platforms, Airbnb, Uber, etc., or whether it's Facebook, etc., are often co-generators of place. So I'm very much inspired by Sarah Barnes's work, who basically, if I'm not wrong, coined the phrase platform urbanism, but it's certainly the first time I came across the term was in her book, which is kind of called platform urbanism. And the emphasis that she makes is that the user is not passive in these relationships with regard to digital platforms. And more importantly, she recognizes the agency that emerges from the social technical assemblages that get formed in the process of when people use technology. So, I mean, she uses the term read-write urbanism, where she says engaging with platform services is today an integral part of being an urban citizen. And as such involves many different kinds of value sharing, not only the value extracted by technology companies. And I guess what that refers to, if I can elaborate on that in the next slide, is that digital platforms are cross-operable. So what we find is that a digital platform is characterized, or that we are characterized by one platform underwriting a critical infrastructural function of another, in the way that Google Maps digital map platform, for instance, serves to infrastructure the visual interface experiences for Uber riders, and that there's technical architectures implicated in urban infrastructure, and this influences urban space. And that's really the bottom line, is that these platforms, as they recombine and as they combine, whether it's Facebook interfacing with WhatsApp, interfacing with perhaps your local ride-hailing apps. I mean, all these things kind of combine in interesting ways, and they do have impacts on urban spaces. And I think we only really tried to kind of figure out what that might look like as we go along. So this term platform urbanism, I think, is worth dwelling on, because it's a feature of our urban lives. And I think in many cases, many of us have moved on from the smart city debates to kind of talk more about platform urbanism, because it has this inherent recognition that these digital ecosystems, if we can call them that, are exactly that. They're ecosystems. They might have a HQ in Silicon Valley, and they might manifest in the form of Uber drivers on your streets or Airbnbs in your neighborhood, but actually they're part of a kind of larger ecosystem that has all sorts of ways to influence the public environment. So it has implications in terms of labor, of course, the economy, governance, infrastructure, maintenance, and Rodrigo has written some really nice work on this in Rio, based on research in Rio. And there's social and cultural practices that we must also consider in this regard. And of course, there's uneven geographies of saturation, but there's also uneven geographies that result from platform urbanism. If we look at the impact, for example, of Airbnb on property markets. So we have to accept that there are winners and losers in the shared economy. And there's obviously governance issues that need to be addressed. And this has come up over and over again, as we know, as Uber has kind of spread its tentacles across the world. So if we look at platform urbanism in the global south, and here we go, I'm quoting Firmino's Rodrigo's work here. But basically, there's this kind of blurring of the boundaries between work and non-work, a distinction that has been rendered meaningless by the computer, the internet, and the smartphone. There's a blurring of boundaries between people's professional lives and their personal lives, or indeed their work lives and their personal lives. And there's also a rather worrying trend, as picked up in the paper, based on Uber drivers in Rio, that kind of looks at how there's a kind of surveillance element that has kicked in, where people's lives are constantly under surveillance by, not by the state, not by the police, but by their employers. Platform landings often also intersect with economic and labor histories, as they do in Cape Town, looking at Pollo's work, which kind of questions its normative Silicon Valleyan rationalities, as Andrea Pollo puts it. And what he refers to there in Cape Town is just how the Uber sort of narrative of entrepreneurship fits very comfortably with the macroeconomic narrative of the Western Cape and Cape Town in particular, which is kind of in its governance is quite neoliberal in its kind of macroeconomic policy. So there's these kind of colonial histories and post-colonial interpretations and relations that we need to kind of examine quite carefully. So the question then is, for me, if public interventions are scarce in the platform urbanism terrain, you know, if it's all about Airbnb and Uber and Lyft and Bolt, all these multinational companies, do homegrown platforms that are developed in particular places, offer a closer attachment to place and therefore better opportunities for, shall we say, more progressive socio-technical evolution? So I probe these possibilities under the following themes and examining examples of how startups and the gig economy evolve in African cities. So I'm going to go through a couple of themes in this regard. And I've spent some time, like I said, in Kampala and Nairobi to explore this further. So let me sort of take this further in the next couple of slides. So looking at the relationship between placemaking, if you like, or maybe spontaneous placemaking, and digital platforms. So like I said, I'm looking at three themes. I mean, the first theme is a bit of a mouthful, but it's essentially, it explores socio-technical agency and the remediation of public life. So as part of the assemblages, the collectives of material, human, and data kind of agencies, digital platforms have become a sort of banal part of an everyday part of urban life, but their impacts are inherently spatial. So how that agency is distributed cannot be assumed to be uniformly in favor of multinational companies such as Uber and Airbnb. And that goes back to Sarah Barnes's point, is that it's not that simple. It's not the evil multinationals that land in places and take over. It really isn't, because the technology allows for something a little bit more granular. So Pollo's discussion of Uber in Cape Town reviews a more subtle play of power, for example, where he looks at how the software enables local narratives and economic assemblages to shape themselves in accordance with context and city aspirations. And some of those city aspirations are around the neoliberal ideal of entrepreneurship, but that very entrepreneurship enabled through the ride-hailing app does actually open up opportunities for people who are battling to find employment in the current job market. So it's that tension between sort of local taking up of opportunities presented by what's essentially a kind of multinational platform that still controls the kind of the terms of labor, I guess. If we look at what sort of recent unhappiness that you're seeing around in Amazon and also in Uber around the way that labor is treated. So there's some interesting tensions there from a labor perspective. But from a city perspective, I think we need to accept that relationships, and this is the second bullet point on the slide that you see in front of you, that the relationship between software, digital platform, and local infrastructures is a kind of quite a dynamic one, and it has material impacts. The material elements of rider platforms not only extend to the physical impacts on space, but beyond the algorithms are the logistics that require management of the network elements across space. The cars, the drivers, the passengers, the payments. I mean, all of this spreads across the city. So place is not just another platform. Place is essentially kind of where a lot of these elements land across the city. So I'm going to take you through an example that I looked at in Kampala, Uganda, which is a ride-hailing app called Safe Border. And I mean, what a digital platform does is it enables partnering of complementary services in a quantifiable and formalized framework with some financial predictability. And what Safe Border is it's a homegrown app which was started by a Ugandan. And borders are motorcycle taxis. I'm sure there's a bunch of terms for them across Latin America as well, but motorcycle taxis are very popular in East Africa. And they are largely informal, or what we call paratransit. So there's no, as much as there's a desire for the state to control them or to regulate them, I mean, it's been largely a difficult process trying to regulate borders. And there's also certainly a lot of, there's a lot of police harassment of riders as well. But nevertheless, there is a safety issue with regard to borders, and Safe Border was started as a response to the safety issues. And so it was founded in 2015, and a big emphasis was to professionalize border riders. So the app was seen, the digital platform was seen as a means to professionalize the sector, or this part of the sector. And this has been expanded. So Safe Border now offers package delivery, sale of airtime, delivery of medicine, delivery of food from local vendors. There's now 3 cloud kitchens that are kind of part of the whole ecosystem. And I guess what I'm trying to show there in that last bullet point in particular is just how this has now become a kind of city-wide function that has livelihood impacts as well as, of course, spatial impacts. I mean, it's locally embedded and inspired, and I think that's what attracted me to this case study. For example, I interviewed the operations manager, and I also interviewed Ricky Thompson, who was the person who started Safe Border. And just looking at 2 quotes, we believe in what we're doing. Africa needs a localized option. And Ricky saying, we're broadening the web for players that aren't connected to the web. So there's a deep desire to provide access to the, well, essentially the platform economy. It's essentially what this is about. But it's also kind of broadened to kind of provide access to local inexpensive food, enable online payment for local services, and especially during the pandemic, this has become increasingly important. The availability of food services to people in lockdown. But there's an impact as well, in a sense that the border community is organized in accordance with what is called stages. Now, stages are fairly ubiquitous across East African cities, and they provide some form of spatial reference to customers. A stage is basically a collection point, and you can see them one up on the screen there. It's a collection point where border riders hang out, and if you're looking for a ride, you walk to a stage and you get a ride from one of the border riders. But of course, now with the app, border riders do not rely on the stage to get their rides, because they now have the app in their hands. So what Safe Border introduces is a more individualized system that enables a broader catchment area. and also facilitating incomes on return rides. So when the driver returns to the stage, they can now get rides as well, which they normally do anyway by just stopping on the street. But the stage system is supposed to kind of provide some form of regulation, not controlled by the state, but controlled by border riders. So it's kind of informal, institutional entity. But I predict, and that's certainly what I have found in my interviews, that the stage system will most likely be disrupted by the platform, by Safe Border. And yeah, so there's a kind of spatial and social legibility of a stage that we might lose as a result of the app. So whilst the broadening of the ride-hailing market space is a formidable challenge for local startups, another form of disruptive hacking, I would argue, is the very diversification required to stay competitive in this growing market. And again, these are often uniquely local and specific to place-based needs. So Beba in Nairobi is a ride-hailing service that was started by drivers and a sort of cooperative of drivers. One of the quotes that I got from one of the drivers was, "We like Uber, we started on the street, not the office." Clearly, that's a misinterpretation of how Uber started. But it's essentially a driver-owned ride-hailing app that allows for some diversification as well through owner car hire schemes and bespoke tours. And then there's also you're starting to see an expansion of ride hailing that also includes, in this case, includes ambulance services. So when you've got large informal areas that are difficult to kind of get in and out of, what we're finding now is there's St. John's Ambulance Services in Kenya has now partnered with another homegrown app called Little Cab, just kind of corporately owned, but it's a local corporate called Safaricom. Some of you might have heard of M-Pesa, which is a mobile money app that was started in Kenya. It's very famous, actually. It was seen to be quite revolutionary. But anyway, M-Pesa was started by Safaricom, and Safaricom have subsequently started Little Cab, which is a ride-hailing app, which in this case has now partnered with St. John's Ambulance Services, that basically enables ambulances to kind of get to places where they need it much faster and much more efficiently. So my second point that I want to make with regard to the relationship between place and platform urbanism in the African context is around scale. So the footloose nature of platform urbanism, the fact that you can kind of move, you can kind of come up with an app and you can kind of start implementing that app in different places, or the ways through which data infrastructures are assimilated into our kind of urban networks, reveals the potential for connections that traverse places, that we can kind of be in many places at once and also maintain the same implementation values. So disruption can travel. And in this case, looking again at Safe Border, what's interesting about Safe Border is they opened in Nigeria and then they opened in Kenya as well. And apparently they're no longer in Kenya. But when I was doing the interviews, what I found quite fascinating is how the values that inform the creation of Safe Border actually traveled together with their app as they move to open the app or sort of start implementation of the app in Ibadan in Nigeria. But before they did that, they did their research to get a sense of people's own lived experiences with regard to the border sector, and also kind of engaging with the kind of local context a little bit more carefully. But there's also a regulatory aspect that we cannot forget, and that is that borders, for example, were banned in Lagos State, which is the most populous state in Nigeria, in February 2020. So any plans to start a safe border in Lagos, which is a massive city of 18 million people, sort of more familiar to those of you in Brazil than we are. You don't often get mega cities like that in Southern Africa, that's for sure. it's yeah, so the regulatory aspect was really important in terms of how this app was rolled out, and the local banking system. So credit card use in Nigeria is actually quite common. M-Pesa is used in Kenya, so it's how you adapt the app to that is important. Looking at the local smartphone uptake, I mean, interestingly, what I did find out is that as much as Safe Border is seen as a success in Uganda, there was still a reluctance by users to kind of use the app, even though the riders felt much safer having the app available to them to get rides. And that's got a lot to do with just technology adoption. And then there's also kind of local complementary systems, services that then become part of the local ecosystems as they evolve in particular places. For example, Sendi in Nairobi is a package delivery service app that was developed in Kenya that now works together with Safe Border. We have to talk about regulation. I mean, there's no way that you can talk about platform urbanism in our context, in any context, without talking about regulation. And so there's these tensions between local vestiges or local manifestations of place-based regulation. You know, what works in Nigeria, what works in Kenya, what is allowed in Kenya, what is allowed in Nigeria. And often these are colonial remnants. I mean, a lot of the laws that are used to harass those people living and working in the informal economy dates back to kind of old British colonial rules that are still being kind of used to manage, well, to plan and manage spaces. And then the kind of increasing political network capacities of what could define the informal, what does define an informal is actually really important. How we think about informality and how informality is seen by public authorities. So regulation is absolutely central to how platform urbanism evolves and how it lands in different places. Technology innovation obviously disrupts markets. I mean, that goes back to the original definition, as well as regulatory regimes. And Safe Border, going back to the example of Safe Border, sort of takes what I found really interesting in my research is how it takes a very dynamic and interactive stance towards regulation. I found that when I was working on the use of drones in Tanzania as well, that when there's no regulatory framework for a particular urban technology solution, then often what you find is these pioneers, if you can call it that, people that actually do this for the first time, take matters into their own hands and they start influencing or trying to influence, and how regulation then takes place subsequently. So yeah, I mean, talking to Ricky Thompson from Safe Border, there was this very dynamic and interactive stance towards regulation, one based on ongoing interaction, proactive lobbying, and political pressure. Where borders are seen as a political constituency. And I think this is the important thing we need to remember, is as much as this is a kind of informal collective, it's quite a sizable collective, and it comes with political power. And it became very clear to me that when you play in this space as a kind of innovator, I guess, if we can use that word, you learn to play that political game. Right, sorry about that pause. I was just trying to see whether I'm doing okay on time. I know that I was told 45 minutes and I seem to be doing fine. So the other term that I often use in my work is the notion of the hybrid city. So in the example of Kenyan rideshare, Beba, for example, the usual rideshare network is expanded to include private car owners renting out their vehicles. The Little Cab example of ambulance services impacts the assemblage of healthcare provision elements that enable emergency care. So the contextual depth that is afforded by a situated approach, I mean, looking at these things contextually with regard to places, reveals how urban life is sometimes rigged together from whatever is at hand. And this is a phrase used by Abdul Malik Simone. And then reassembled into a socio-technical configuration that brings with it maybe new, maybe old spatial configurations. And I I think that through disruption and recombination, what we're seeing is that the material elements of the city, the relationships between interest groups, the exchange of information, all of these are recombined into assemblages that may very well disrupt existing relations. So infrastructure spaces become mediums of information as new codes evolve to contribute to kind of a hybrid co-produced urban form. And I think this is something we can do more research on to see what these urban forms look like once these kind of various digital platforms expand and change as they kind of adapt to their own kind of contextual uniqueness. For example, I would argue that the literature on platform urbanism and indeed smart city writing that focuses on the dynamics of place generally lacks this dimension of inquiry. I think there's definitely work that can be done here where we look at how space is then co-created. I mean, blanket readings of infrastructure systems, such as the deployment of smart in place, runs the danger of ignoring the subtleties and dynamics of hybrid places. So Mitchell's dream, we can reimagine it as a kind of democratic and citizen-oriented way of recombination and placemaking. But there's also resistance to the externalities of platform urbanism, which we must take into account. I've done some research on civil society organizations that use digital platforms to tell stories through social media about the fallout of Airbnb and what the impact is on neighborhoods and gentrification and so forth. So there's some interesting combinations of ideas that we can definitely look at in terms of how spaces are continuously co-created. So yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm arguing towards is a more hopeful interpretation of platform urbanism and smart cities. The importance of place, embeddedness and situatedness, differentiated services have enhanced heterogeneity, but not necessarily addresses structural inequalities. And there's many uncharted futures of platform urbanism, which I would argue is not within the control only of Silicon Valley, but is actually of the functions of relationships between algorithms, people, and place. Because platforms evolve and can manifest in unpredictable and generative ways. I just want to end off with a quote from a wonderful paper by Lesinski, and where she talks about the glitches of platform urbanism. Revealing the glitches or platform cracks reveals possible urban futures formed in more equitable ways via technical maneuverings through strategically organized platform urban environments enacted in the form of everyday digital practices or praxis at platform city interfaces. And that's essentially what I was trying to reveal with the examples with you. And I would then argue that in Kampala, in Nairobi, and Cape Town, and I would guess probably in Curitiba, in Rio, in Sao Paulo as well, these futures already exist if we just look for them quite carefully. So let me end off on that very hopeful note. And I'm sorry I'm not there to answer any questions, but I think Rodrigo is going to do his best to answer questions on my behalf. But of course, I would be happy to participate in any future dialogue on this work. And I wish you all the very best with your semester and with your work continuing forward. And let me stop my share. And thank you again for this wonderful opportunity. And please stay safe and please stay sane during these very, very difficult times. Obrigada.